The 80s had the General. The 90s had John Gilligan. In the noughties, it was the reign of Martin Marlowe Hyland. His was a familiar path with success and power, and then the recklessness. He had to go, because with him, an innocent young man doing an honest day's work died. Crime World presents Caught in the Crossfire, the unsolved murders of coke kingpin Marlowe Hyland and innocent Anthony Campbell. Available now on all podcast platforms. You asked me what caught my eye in this story, and I have to be perfectly honest and say to you the big standout for me was that this convicted drug dealer is a father of 15. How have you time to do anything? I mean, that's a kind of a family from ancient history.
Yeah, it's pretty big, all right.
Isn't it?
By, I think, any standards. It was big. It was
come
big
across
by the 1950s standards.
Big families like that these days anymore. Now it's is the one woman that produced all these?
Yes, and his previous wife. So we're talking about Dermot Calvert.
Previous wife.
His wife that they separated from. This came out in the Criminal Assets Bureau. He separated from his wife, I think, before 2014, before these assets that were the subject of a Proceeds of Crime Act were accrued. And I believe she actually, it wasn't said in court, but I believe she's actually passed away since. But he's now married to another woman called Martina Harty, who has 5 children of her own. So,
can you imagine Christmas Day in that house?
Well, I'm sure it's
and
busy.
They're all grown up, I'm sure, a lot of the 15. And his poor wife passed away. She had 15 children and they separated and then she died.
Yeah, sadly enough, yeah. Now, it's important to mention now, there was 3 people named in this Criminal Assets Bureau case, right? So it's Dermot Calvert, who's kind of the main person. He's kind of seen as the main target. He has, I think it's 91 convictions. 7 of those were for what was termed as income generating offences. And then there was 4 for drug dealing for sale and supply. So out of his 91 convictions, so presumably a lot of them for road traffic and kind of minor enough stuff. Yeah, he'd seen, and he says himself he's been pretty busy. Like in these affidavits, the way it's going, we're only kind of actually halfway through this hearing, even though it happened like in the middle of June, and day 2 isn't going to happen until later in July. It's just the way, I suppose, the timing of the court and when it's available. So basically, we got the Criminal Assets Bureau case against him, against his daughter Stacey Calvert, and against Dermot Calvert's now wife Martina Harty. And then there was a 4th guy mentioned. He's not a respondent in the case, but he was mentioned in court. A chap called David Casey, who was Stacey's husband or Stacey's partner, and they're living in one of the properties that is the subject of this. So I mean, it's kind of. Like we actually haven't got the full sight of everything behind the case as yet. Okay. But it has been interesting. So I mean, basically we had the counsel for CAB has basically run through what their arguments are, and then also refers to the replying affidavits that so far have been submitted by Mr. Calvert and presumably the other people that were mentioned as respondents.
And Martina Harty and his daughter Stacey, they're respondents, which means that Dermot Calvert is essentially the target of this CAB case, Proceeds of Crime case, and the other 2s maybe have names on properties or on assets. Yeah.
It's so their names are on it, but I suppose the argument for CAB, no more than they did it with, if you remember the Ross Browning case, is that this is the man who generated the money illegally through crime, and he ultimately has control of these properties, even though someone else's name is on it, and that's really the nub of the case. And I mean, and I suppose I should point out that Stacey Calvert has no involvement in crime. It was explicitly stated she had no criminal convictions whatsoever. And similarly with Martina Harty, she has a number of convictions, but they're nothing to do with drug dealing. They're nothing to do with any kind of that professional career criminal. Again, I think it's all road traffic or minor stuff to that effect. So it's certainly nothing to do with the money that was going into these properties, which were bought in Garryowen in Limerick for, I suppose, relatively small money. One of them was a house bought for $17,000 in 2014. Now CAB were making the argument that this house was severely undervalued at the time it was bought. They're suggesting it was derelict, but they're also suggesting that they didn't really do much to it, even though it's done to a nice high standard. They spent something like that. The Criminal Assets Bureau are saying that 205,000 worth of refurbishments were done on this 2-bed semi-D. So, it's echoes of, some of these other cases we've heard with hundreds of thousands being put into the small thing. Now, it should be said that Dermot Calvert...
So what are they saying, that these refurbishments were or weren't done? They were done?
Well, CAB's argument is that they were done. And they valued them...
was undervalued when he bought it.
They were saying, one, it was undervalued, that was bought for cash, and it was undervalued for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And then they're estimating that 200,000, just a bit over 200,000, was put into refurbishing this house and building a granny flat at the back, which is where Dermot Calvert now lives with Martina, and they have their house in at the back of the other house where his daughter and partner and kids live.
Can you imagine it would be like a train station? The amount of people, if they have between them 20 children, plus many of them are grown up and have partners presumably, and there's various grandchildren. I mean, the house must be like...
Yeah, and I suppose you can see why then there was a third property that he bought as well, which was basically a derelict shop not too far away, also in Garryowen. And there was a roof put on it, and there was more money. I think the estimate there was something like 140,000 or something was put into it. Now, he actually, we only heard some of his... We heard some of his evidence that hasn't been put forward yet, because it's basically CAB's running through all the affidavits, and they're saying, well, this is something in contention. Mr. Calvert in his affidavit, said this or says that. He's basically denying the claim. And there was one Garda interview where he laughed at the valuation that was put on it, saying there was nothing like it. He's trying to claim they did the work himself. But the main crux of the argument appears to be, from what we know from what CAB are saying, is that he actually saved his money from his social welfare. And that's where the money came from. And there was some money then in terms of Martina Harty came from compensation.
Under questioning, you mean, by CAB? This is in the affidavits, but he will still get his opportunity to put forward his defence in another day in court. But under questioning by the Criminal Assets Bureau, he was suggesting that the money to refurbish the house and to buy these properties came from social welfare payments.
Yeah, and he makes the point that at one stage he was getting in child benefit allowance.
How much?
Alone, not just for that, no other social welfare payments included, of $1,600 a month. So that was just for... $1,600
a month would have only been 10 children. So you see, the others are probably over the age of... Only 10. Am I right?
I don't know. My children are all over 18 now, so I've forgotten.
Or €150 a month.
Yeah.
I think, per child, is it?
Well, it could have been, this is all kind of pre-2017, because basically social welfare then, after the CAB investigation, the information that they got, because CAB would have a social welfare person on board with them. And so they were cut off at that stage because they hadn't declared this various property. So some of the means tested kind of payments were cut. I think that some of them I think it was kind of confusing. They kind of went through all the various social welfare payments, and there was different figures like, €44,000 overpayment was made and all the rest, because they basically, as a result of the Garda investigation, have revisited how much money was paid to the family and different family members over the years. So all that's been kind of looked at. And that's, I'm guessing, from what I gather from the time frame involved, is 2014 to 2017. But the gist of it, I suppose, from CAB is that basically all the money it came from criminal activity. I think it's the one affidavit I did get to see was Michael Gubbins, the chief bureau officer, detective superintendent, who's basically in charge of CAB. He said it was his belief the property was acquired directly or indirectly from the proceeds of crime. And we know that there's some other kind of allusion, or it's alluded to in some of the CAB affidavits, that he was regularly seen in the company of known drug dealers. Didn't say who. And we know that Dermot Calvert is going to make the argument that, look, these were just old neighbours and friends, and why wouldn't he be, running into people that he's known since he was a young man?
Now, there was a search or a raid carried out on this home that the daughter lives in the main home, and he and his new partner live out in the granny flat in the back, in June of 2019. And that was in response to information that drugs were being sold from the house. I think the Gardaí found bundles of cash and some plastic bags. A lot of plastic bags, 2,000 of them. Yeah,
this is money that was found under, I think, the kitchen kickboard in the granny flat. And there was also, I think it was 2,000 little plastic baggies, which CAB suggest were part of, drug dealing, that this is what you use to cut up bags, to cut up your drugs and put in, small amounts to sell. We know that from one of the affidavits that was again mentioned by Cab, that Dermot Calvert suggesting that these were just food freezer bags and that they're very handy when you have a lot of kids, that you divide up the money, divide up the food and you're able to freeze things. They were simply food bags and there was nothing untoward about them, I think is the phrase that was mentioned in court.
You'd be freezing a hell of a lot of food with 2,000 of them, wouldn't you?
Well, I suppose sometimes these things, they're hard to buy singly, like if you go into Lidl for a zip bag, I think, you have to buy 20 at least.
I never have one of them. I never.
When you need them, because they're really handy, and then everyone else in the house seems to use them for all sorts of things. I'm not selling drugs. I'm talking about food mostly, I hope.
I should maybe buy a stash of 2,000 of them, and then I'll never run out. My house is raided, and it comes up in court.
But the
drug paraphernalia.
But there was one of these. Sorry, there was two separate raids on the granny flat, and one of them, like whatever it was, I think it was. The first time round, it was about 17,000 that was found with the plastic baggies. Now, it mentioned that there was a tiny amount of cocaine found, but it was like a single bag of cocaine or something. And I think that Judge Jones said, look, this is irrelevant. He pointed out there's nothing, this really not got to do with anything here. There was no evidence about whose it was or how it came to be there or anything like that. But in the same place then, or in the same granny flat a year later, 5,850 was found in a bedside drawer, which said Miss Harty did not come from criminal activity, and suggested like her various income streams included the sale of a camper van as a compensation claim and from working as a cleaner as well. Now, Cab make the argument that when they raided the house the year before, this money wasn't there, and this money is supposed to have come from a compensation claim that was well before the raid. So, like Cab's argument is, look, all these assertions are being made by the Calverts, and that there's no evidence to back up their claims.
Their accountant or whoever works on their figures has said that if the couple were to be believed that this money came from their social welfare payments, they've worked out that the couple were living on €38 a week.
Yeah, this is the lifestyle analysis that the Criminal Assets Bureau do.
You really got to have your ducks in a row for the Criminal Assets Bureau, don't you?
Yeah, and and he was coming. This thing I hadn't heard of before. That Mr. Calvert was saying he was doing Nixers, he was doing Tomo jobs, which is an app, be it Tomo, and you can pick up kind of handyman work, like if someone needs a couple of slates moved around or whatever, or a hedge trimmed or something like that. It's an app. Yeah, there you go. I was wondering what a Tomo job was initially, but I looked it up and found out the hard way. Or the old-fashioned way.
Yeah.
And Calvert just saying, look, it's incredible that this money could have been saved from social welfare payments, and and by their own figures, they had €38 to live on. So where were they going to come up with the 17 grand to buy the house, and then the 205,000 then to actually refurbish it, and then that's now valued at 170,000, that one, and the shop then was bought. It's been valued at, I think it's like 140,000.
It's quite a lot of money, isn't it?
And they estimated that 48,000 was spent on that. And sorry, it's valued at 125,000. So I mean, it's a nice little investment, like, when
and quite big prizes for the Criminal Assets Bureau to go after.
Yeah, but I think, like, now again, we haven't heard too much about Dermot Calvert. We know in the past that he has these drug convictions. We also know that I think there was a High Court action involving himself and Martina Harty previously, separately, to get them out of a house. And again, I can't remember exactly the reasons behind it.
Was that a rental house or a council house?
It was a house that was actually in receivership at one stage, and they stayed on. And they were taken to the High Court and told that they had to get out, or that they'd be in prison for contempt of court. And that order was made in April 2018. So it was kind of, it was around the time that Cab first started investigating them. A receiver for the house in that case said locks on the property had been changed, and it was occupied by people who had no right to be there. So it looks like they were kind of
defaulted on a loan or something.
Well, I don't actually know. It doesn't say.
A receiver was appointed one way or another, which is usually because the owner hasn't paid the mortgage, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, or again, it could be a question of people, moving into a house that wasn't theirs in the first place.
True,
they see somewhere nearby that's empty and they just move in, and that's, we've seen that pattern quite a bit around the country over the years. Certainly in Limerick, we know where people involved in serious crime have basically taken over properties that they have absolutely no link to, and forced neighbours out or left houses deliberately empty because they want to kind of keep their own areas, I suppose, sterile of potential rivals or people they don't like.
I noticed in that case that the couple represented themselves and they did give, in the end, they gave some sworn undertakings that they'd vacate the property. Have they appointed counsel?
Well, it's funny you should mention that, because there was the argument over free legal aid, and they wanted two separate counsel, one for each for Dermot Calvert and his wife Martina Harty, which Judge Owen said he wasn't going to do. Like, why should a married couple who are basically their interests align? It's not like they've broken up over this and that one person is claiming part of the property as separately theirs. So he refused that, but he did allow a legal aid certificate on the basis that they were living in the granny flat, which is subject to, it's one of the five, I suppose, items that are being sought by CAB to be declared the proceeds of crime. And so he allowed a single free legal aid certificate to be shared between two counsel. And then because Stacey Calvert herself, was a mother with children living in a house that's also the target, she was allowed to have her own counsel. So she would have, a separate argument. So now we haven't actually heard from these counsel yet, but there was a brief outline of the case as the arguments were made for the legal aid. I think Stacey's legal aid application had been made previously. I think it was I think in February this year she went ahead and got it. I mean, this has been taken along on the list now since late last year.
There's been a huge focus on Limerick, but from the Criminal Assets Bureau cases, I think it was the as regards cases being taken, it was the biggest area outside Dublin a few years ago. That was what the figures were showing with targets. So they've obviously got quite highly skilled and trained profilers down in that region and are identifying. You don't see quite as many cases coming up from other parts of the country as frequently as you do from Limerick.
Yeah. And we know that, there's been some big operations that have been targeting particularly kind of the Keane network. And there's been a number of recent criminal convictions. We know there's a man who's described as, trusted lieutenant of Christy Keane Senior, Dermot Plum McManus. When you look at it, it's relatively small amount. It's money laundering charges. I think it's something like 30,000, whatever, hidden in socks in the sleeve of a coat and stuff like that. He was named in other CAB cases, with the Bone Motors. He was one of these guys at the kind of the Board of Governors meeting, that had both sides, of the so-called feud in Limerick that were actually cooperating to launder the money. So, and again, one of Christy Keane's close relatives has been, recently convicted as well. And again, one of her kids and his partner also convicted. You can see why CAB might be going into these areas over what might be considered kind of small enough cases, but it really sends out a signal to people who are known to be involved in, the criminal drug trade, that they're not going to be able to sit around and enjoy their assets, that they can't flaunt it in front of, ordinary people who are sticking to the rules, who are making an honest living.
And I suppose as well, when you put together, when you add up all those 30,000s and 70,000s and this, that and the other, it does come to a great amount. I was only just reminded today of the 1996 beginnings of the Criminal Assets Bureau. One of the first operations they put in place was Operation Alpha, which was against essentially the Hutch organised crime group at the time. And while they got small amounts from certain people, they got big amounts from others. And I think it was one of certainly in the early few decades of the Criminal Assets Bureau existence, together that operation netted, 20, 30 million for the state. So, yeah, the Limerick situation has been the targeting of the gangs and their sort of associates, and people sort of rippled out from the big kingpins, I suppose. And we'll see what... Look, maybe Mr. Calvert has nothing to do with any of those gangs, and maybe he was just talking to neighbours, but we shall see what he has to say the next time. Thanks, Eamon.
That was a pleasure, Nicola.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.